So now I am ready to start step 4 of my project, which is texturing. I did my texturing in Substance Painter, as you can tell here, and some points that I would like to make before I start texturing is more or less my mindset before I started working on this and the way that I went on texturing this. So I have my concept art right here, and the first thing I noticed while I was working on this project is that my textures or the material and the color of my concept is influenced a lot by the lighting. So here you can see that there's a gradient occurring from here to here. There's a gradient occurring here to here, here to here, as well as from here to here. This one mostly because of the shadow, but you can clearly see it from this area right here. Where I can pull that up a little bit more, you can see how it goes from this brown tan color to this yellow brown color. So my goal in this is to replicate the gradients that would be affected by the light because it's being caused by the light, and essentially just putting that down onto my textures. The reason why is because I knew that I would be working in Sketchfab, and Sketchfab has a pretty limited setup for their lights. It's not like Marmoset or Unreal or Maya where you'll be able to go into the nitty-gritties of the lights that you set up and being able to have an effect in certain areas. Sketchfab is overall user-friendly, so they try to make it as simple as possible for you to set up your lighting there. So in this case, I knew that I wanted to be able to have this gradient look coming from here to here, here to here, and here to here, as well as these different tones and hues of the materials on my textures and not rely so much on my lighting. So for my lighting, my main focus was getting the warm tone here, the blue light here, and the warmer color light that's coming here and hitting this area and this area here. I explained that a lot more in step 5, which is my presentation shot and my final publishing, but for now I'm going to be mentioning it just so you guys know why I decided to approach my project the way I did. Again, this is not really a tutorial, it is a breakdown, so I won't be going too much in details of each layer that I do, but I will explain the setup for each one. Another thing I would like to mention is I got a lot of influence from a lot of stylized artists out there for my textures, so I looked up a ton of YouTube videos on texturing for metal and wood, specifically for stylized, and one great artist that I found is the person who runs 3D-EX. I followed his stylized material tutorial for some parts of it. Some parts just did not go well with the project that I was going for, but I got a lot of influence from him, and I also learned a lot from watching his tutorials, so I was able to apply that knowledge onto my project, as well as the knowledge that I did experimenting with some of the layers that I created, and experimenting with some of the tools that my teachers and lab instructors had shown me over the course of me being in school. So I took all of that knowledge and kind of Frankensteined it together and was able to get my final look. But before I even begin with that, the first thing I gotta do is bake out my maps. So here what I did was I began with baking. If you've ever used Substance Painter, it's pretty easy to import your project in. So I imported my low-res model, and then after that I went to my texture set settings. I usually work in 4K, but since I am recording and my textures, this is my final Substance Painter file, I wanted to work in 2K. I will be showing you my work in 4K after I'm done with this, but for now I will be working in this resolution. So I go to my Bake Mesh maps, and you will see here that I have all my high res. They are underscored with high, so it's underscore high. I usually do when I'm testing my my high res maps. So here is the baking texture settings, and here is where I test out my high res bakes to my low res, and the way that I usually do that is by turning off all of these mesh maps and just having my normal. I put it at 2K, and here I just really don't change this. I have a desktop that allows me to be able to do this anti-aliasing subsampling 8x8, so to me that works for me, but I usually have this at 2 when I'm beginning a test. I also make sure that my by mesh name match is clicked on, and I make sure that my low and my high are named correctly. So I usually bake my textures. I'm not going to do that now, but if that doesn't end up working, I look at what the mistakes is. Oh, okay, there we go. What I usually do is I have my normal mapped baked out, and then I just look through every part of my project. I tend to notice if I have problems, it's usually at the edges, so that is my main concern, is looking at the edges and seeing if there's any big problems. I also make sure that the look of this detail that I put into the project is being shown, and I make sure that it's looking the way that I want it to without having it skewed or completely off. I don't see any major problems within the project while checking to see if there are any mistakes or any problems. I also check here, and I also look at the fabric. The high res baked down pretty well in that area, as well as the wrinkles coming out pretty well. They're not having any problems. So after checking to see that everything is good, I then go back to my baked mesh maps. I check to see if the settings are great, awesome. So after that, I end up working with my 4K map, and I click on everything except my ID, since I didn't do any IDing on this, and then I up this up to 8x8, and then that's about it. Is really all I do to baking. I've never really had problems with baking before, besides like having to test it a few times, or reminding myself to name it correctly, which is my biggest fault, is sometimes I forget to do the underscore high with a lowercase. So that's pretty much honestly the biggest problems I usually have with baking. But if you do want to learn more about baking, there are great tutorials done by Substance Painter that goes really in depth of how they do these mesh maps. So after looking at my concept and after baking down my map, the first thing I want to do is create my base layer. So I will be doing that now. So we are now going to begin So after baking down my maps and making sure that everything looked correct, my first step was to create my base layer for my project. So I began with the side piece that is here. The reason why is because I was going to use this as a base for the rest of my wood texture. As I mentioned beforehand, since I wanted to get this gradient look, some of these are going to have different colors as the base, which is fine. I just wanted to have you guys know that I didn't just create one whole layer for everything and then applied it to the entire model that was wood. As you can see here, this part of the door is extremely dark, and it's not anything close to how the rest of the project looks. This handle right here is extremely light. Right here is a lighter color than here and here. These are a lot more warmer colors. So for that, I had to make sure that I know exactly how I was going to go about this. So for the leg stands, I made them a little bit darker, and I wrote that down, that the leg stands and the door are darker than the base of the project. So I'm going to call this the base, since that is usually what I do first and base my project around that. So this is my base, and then for the two top pieces, I just worked on one layer and then duplicated this one over to this one, and I just brightened it up slightly more than this one just so I could get this look here, but I knew that the light would be influencing this a lot, so I didn't worry too much of making these two different colors. This was the exact same layer. I just duplicated the layer that I used for this one, and this shelf, I worked on this shelf right here, duplicated over here, brightened it a bit more, and then just duplicated that one over here. And the same things for the metals. So these metals right here are exactly the same as the metals that are down here. And the metal that is right here, I just ended up having that by itself. And right here, the sword with its own certain layer. I didn't really duplicate this over to anything else because, as you can tell, this has a lot more, I would say, I would have to add a little bit more AO to this to create that gradient that is here. So in that case, it's just honestly planning ahead of how you plan on texturing and making sure that you look at your concept a lot. That is what I did, and it did help me figure out how to do the coloring for my project. So in this, again, I'm not going to give a really in-depth tutorial of how I did this. I'm just going to explain I'm just going to mention the layers and kind of the filters that I added to them. So obviously for my base, I just added a base color. I just have my roughness and color that's really influencing it. The metal is just there. But here I made sure that my roughness was a little bit lower, so it wasn't too shiny, because wood isn't extremely shiny, especially old worn out wood. So after that, this is something that I learned from 3DEX from one of their tutorials, is to create kind of this they called it edges, and at first I wasn't very confused by what they mean, but now I understand what it means. Is it emphasizes the area that is around the edges, so it kind of creates a lighter color in the center, and the base color that you have, so if I was to turn this off, is just around the edges here, and right over here as well, and it's just creating kind of a bright center that your eye is going to be drawn out to the edges. That's just practically what it's doing for this. It was a mask editor, and I just changed some of the settings to make it work for my project a little bit more. Since this is going to be affected by the blue lighting, my main focus was if I was to shift the lighting around, it would fit with the overall project, but I still wanted to be sure that if you remove the lighting from this, it wasn't just going to be one solid color and call it quits because the light's going to, change it. I wanted to make sure that if you saw this without the light, it would still look, like part of the closet. So for this, I just did the mask editor, changed some of the balances to it, the global balance. The next thing I did was add a sharpen to it. You can see that it mostly affects this area, right here, around the edges. Just brings more emphasis in those areas. Again, sorry for having it in 2K, but really don't want my computer to poop out on me. The next thing is adding a cavity to it. This kind of just adds an overall kind of darker color on top of it, just to add variety to it. You can change the opacity. You're more than welcome to do this. I just kept it like that because I thought it looked fine. Again, this is just the mask editor. This is something I was a bit hesitant on using since I am not like super confident with using lights and baked lighting in Substance Painter. That's just something that's foreign to me, but 3DEX videos helped me get a little bit more comfortable with using it, at least experiment wise, and in this case it did help out. I put it very, very low, as you can tell here, because if I was to even have it super bright, it would just completely wash out the colors that I had beforehand. It would just make it straight orange. But in this case, since I wanted the color to complement this, I knew that in this project there are a lot of browns and yellows, but I wanted to just add a little bit of red to it, and orange to just bring a little bit more emphasis on the wood texture. So after that, just added an AO. This was done, and it's saving, but this was done just to bring emphasis on the cavity that is right here of the wood carving, as well as bringing some emphasis on the edge around the tacking marks. And it also brings your eye up to the edge. So that is practically what my AO is. I put this on a generator that was used with a dirt generator that uses your AO a lot. So if you look here, this is something that my teacher showed us how to get these darkened edges to kind of create a semi gradient. It's very subtle, but it does just bring emphasis to this area right here, which could bring your attention here. So that is just how it is. It also does kind of give the illusion of dirt building, since dirt would build in areas like this, since it is an older piece of furniture. So having this is here. This I can explain to you. I took a brown color that was darker than my base, removed the roughness, went over here, added the black mask, added the generator, went over here, added a dirt generator, and here you can change the contrast of how it looks. You can, sometimes even if you want it there and you want it to have a sharp contrast, you can do it like that, but I like to have a softer look. So that is what I added to my project, and you can see quite the difference here. It's just kind of like a solid-ish color. I mean, there is a bit of a gradient, and you can see a lighter center here, but just adding this just gives a little bit more of depth to the project, and you can notice that it affects the areas that are there, so it just creates a shadow in that area that complements the look. So after that, I added another bake lighting. This is just a subtle one. This wasn't really necessary in my project, to be honest. I wanted to try bake lighting from the tutorials that I saw on 3DEX videos, but I kind of want to try it out. I don't really think that it influences a lot on the project, but I just kept it there because I wanted to say that I at least used it. The next thing I did was add a edge highlight. This is something that you should definitely have no matter what your piece is, even if it's a subtle one, but in this case it is a worn look, and I wanted to show a passage of time on this, and what is better than showing off a worn look to the edge. So in this case I added a edge highlight. I made it lighter than my base color. I added a black mask, and then I went over here, added a generator, and added a metal edge wear. So here I added the edge highlight, made it lighter color than my base. In this case, on my actual project, I have different versions or different colors of edge highlights that you can see. So I have this one right here that I actually based the color off of, so I just colored picked that. Oh, another tip I would really recommend for you guys to do. It is 100% okay for you guys to color pick straight from the concept. I do that and am able to replicate a lot closer to the concept. I know some people don't do that, and I don't know how they get away with it, because I've actually seen tutorials of people being able to just click the button and being like, that's the exact color, and I'm like, you guys got an eye that I do not have. So in this case, I color picked a lot. So for the base color of this base of my project, I actually ended up color picking in this area. I think I went with something that was like right here. And then for the darker areas that I saw, I ended up color picking from that little corner, if you can see it, just this little brown area right here, since that's kind of what I wanted. And then for the gradients, I ended up color picking from this. I think I went for a lighter color because I didn't want such a harsh one, and I'll be showing you that as well. But I did color pick most of my colors from this exact concept, if not all. So here I have my metal edge wear, and here you can change the wear level. I would say don't have anything like this. It just looks dirty to me, and not like the purpose. So here I added the edge highlight, and then I just changed the wear level here. I went for a mid type of one where it was just having a very strong highlight, but the thing with this is if you look at it, it's a little bit too uniformed. Well, not back here, but in the front, it's a little bit too uniform. There are some areas here that are just covered by the edge highlight. So in that case, I just come in with a paintbrush and erased some of that. So I just used an alpha and I went for dirt, and I think I ended up picking dirt cloudy. This is great because it has so this is great because it has those edges that are broken up, and it also has the gray and white and black values, but just go through here. Don't pick something that's straight up a line. It's going to look a little bit too noticeable. In this case, I just went with dirt stain, the dirt cloud. I went down. There's brushes for the Kyle brushes are pretty good too. I like using those if I'm going a little bit more in detail for this, but since I knew that I just wanted to break it up a little bit, that's all I did to this. The next thing I did was add a bit more of a dark value to these edges right here. I think it worked well because if you look at the concept, it is pretty dark here, and I wanted to showcase that with the shadows pointing down. If you see here, the color is very dark as well as here and here. So I just went in with a paintbrush, and I can show you how messy I went. I literally just swiped and then I changed the opacity of it to lower it. I didn't remove it completely, but make sure that you are lowering the opacity to it, and that, I would say, does a pretty good job of putting in an AO in there without actually having to change the AO that's like up here. So after that, this is a layer that I accidentally misplaced. This is the layer that affects here. Just wanted to make sure you know that, because if I was to click on this and then go to mask, you will see it affects that area right there. So it just affects that one. So the next step that I did was adding a texture detail to this. It didn't really change it too much, so I'm just going to brighten this up a little bit more. I honestly should have made this a little bit brighter, or a little bit lighter than the actual color of my base color. As you can see, here is just what it looks like. What I ended up doing was going in here, going to a grunge map, adding a grunge to it, and then changing the levels. This is something that I was taught in school to add somewhat of texture to it without disrupting the scene. This is just to add a subtle change to it. Don't make it super dramatic, but in this case I wanted to just add a little bit to it so it would just affect the edges here. So if you see in the actual thing, if I was to click on it, you can see it like right in these areas. I did show that a little bit more on the shelves, since the shelves, I would say, are going to get dirty. They're going to have a lot more stains on them, so I did add them to the shelves a lot more. But in this area, I guess I didn't want to emphasize that too much, but that is something that I would say I should have done. I also changed the opacity from 100 to 51 was the number. So let me change that. And this is just something to keep your project from just having a flat color. Or not a flat color, but just a unbusy texture towards it. You don't have to do that. I just did it because wood textures are never just a color of like gradients. It does have some stains to it, so I made sure to add that on there. Next thing, so for this one, all I added was, again, another darker color. So for me, what I was trying to achieve in this is, because I noticed this in the project, I should have emphasized it a little bit more, but there is a dark color here and then a lighter color that goes out. I guess I was trying to go for that, but the thing is, it's really not that noticeable unless you're like right on top of it. So that's just an extra layer I have to create a deeper line here for the AO. That's again just a dirt generator. Change the dirt level and created a higher contrast for the dirt. The next thing I did is my gradient. So in this case, I would say please remember what I mentioned beforehand, where I wanted to add gradients because I know that my lighting wasn't going to be able to achieve this look that I wanted. So in this case, I used this as a base for how this was going to look. So I went from darker to lighter here. So I will show you how I did that. So I picked a color that was a red brown. I would say that's a pretty deep brown. So that's a little bit darker. Well, not a little bit. It's actually a lot darker than my base. And I go up here and I click on it. And you can see the change in the overall look. And it just adds a gradient from here to here. And I ended up achieving the look that I wanted with that. Also, I know the blue lighting is going to affect here, but I did add it to every other individual piece that is in the project. I also added a bit of roughness to it. So if I was to go to the roughness channel, you can see that there is a bit of a roughness change there. That's just so it's not just one flat color, but at the end, I added a roughness layer. I misspelled that. I was kind of in a rush writing these things down. But here, I just added a roughness. So, roughness layer. I removed everything else, pumped this up to be higher, and then I went in here, went into the masks, and went to the mask editor and messed around with the settings. I am actually kind of thankful for 3D for showing me a lot about the mask editor. I didn't really use it a lot since it seemed very daunting to me, but having him explain each setting and also being able to show us how it works in his tutorial videos honestly helped a lot for me to do this by myself. This was a great thing that my lab instructor mentioned to me, is because I always felt like my project was always too flat. Every time I did a portfolio piece, and one day my lab instructor was just like, oh, just add a roughness channel. And this definitely helps a lot more with metals, but it also helps out with just overall textures in general, just helps a lot more with metals. And she told me add a roughness map to it. You can add a generator. She usually tells me to either add a dirt. You can switch between these. Heck, you can even sometimes use the smart masks or the grunges, but in this case I wanted to test it out with the mask editor, and I actually really liked how it came out. So if I was to pop it out, I did that, and here I just added the different textures that you can see here. I think I only used it for that one. A big thing I would recommend you to do if you plan on using this somewhat as a tutorial is to know that Sketchfab has a tendency to not show off the roughness so much on stuff that isn't metal. So if you are using Sketchfab as your presentation program, make sure to up your roughness just slightly more than what you think you would need, just so it'll show up on Sketchfab. So after doing that, I just showed you the basic or the base of almost all my layers that are here, the metal being a little bit different and the flag, but I can explain that to you. And those are the layers I did. And after that, I just went through each piece of my project. So here, the stands, like I said beforehand, I knew that my legs were going to be darker, so my base color for that is darker. I went to the wood small. This is just a duplicate of this. I ended up making this a little bit darker, just so you look at this, it is a bit darker in these areas compared to like this. So I did just duplicate this over and made it darker. The next thing is the middle top here. You can see that there is a grading coming from here to here. The reason why I didn't make this super warmed tone like this, almost a yellow orange, is because I was going to use a light from Sketchfab that was going to just focus on directly this. I was going to have my environment light that focused on the middle, my blue light that comes here, and my light that comes down here that was going to give off a yellow-orange tint that would give the effect that I want from this. Like I mentioned beforehand, I went through all of my edges and broke them up some pieces. So that's just something I also did. This one is the gradient as well, so I have it going from dark to light. It's the same exact generator. The only thing that I would change is my position of the X, Y, and Z, and sometimes I would change the radius, the offset, and the contrast, and sometimes you would even need to invert it. It's just usually messing around with the scene. Try starting off with everything on default and then just move the settings corresponding with the direction that you want it to go. So the next one I did was the bottom, and here I had a lot of my AO having this darkened look to it, and I think it did a really good job of kind of showing a old worn look to it. You can even sometimes see the roughness here. Yeah, that doesn't really show up too much in Sketchfab, so like I said beforehand, just boop it up a little bit more. If you think you have it, you probably need a little bit more. So after doing my bottom, the next thing I did was my shelf. So here you can see a lot more of the dirt or the texture look that I was going for, as well as roughness and that gradient, since in the back of the picture you can see that there is that dark gradient that is there, as well as here and here. So I actually did a harsher gradient in these areas just to show the depth within the bookcase, as well as when the light is hitting there, no matter how the environment is set up, this is always going to be dark. So after doing that, I just duplicated it over and used that. As you can tell, I changed the colors for slightly on some of them, just so they don't all look the same. And then if you look at the roughness, I did add the dirt, so I made them all different. That is something I would recommend you to not do. I tried it out, and I thought it looked a little bit too off. So I would recommend you to try to keep at least a minimum of like 2 different maps for your roughness, and just changing the opacity or the overall balance of it if you want to like remove some of the roughness from it. So, and this, I worked on my handle. I made my handle lighter because in the concept you can see that is lighter. You can also see in the concept that it goes very dark here and then just brightens up very quickly to the top. So I was able to do that. So I just, again, added the gradient from here to here. I just pulled it back a lot more so it would just be focused here. And next thing I did was the metal base. Here you can see a very, very strong gradient, and again, the reason for this is so I would be able to set up my lights however I want and not have to worry about, oh, this is gonna look super bright, it's gonna look, you know, like it's lit inside. I didn't have to worry about that. After doing that, I added my wooden door. Again, this is something that I actually ended up creating some different layers for, so let me open that up. So here I changed a lot of my baked lighting. I ended up removing some of the stuff on there. And here, so after I finished my handle, I started working on my door, and you can see quite a difference between my main piece, which are very similar in color, just slight shifts of hues within it, to just having a straight up almost brown door. Like it shows in the concept, it is quite a difference. I just wanted to make sure that I had my highlight be a little bit yellow. So when you look at this, the highlight is a lot more yellow compared to this, and that's just because I wanted to have that defined a little bit more. I added a gradient coming from down here to here. I just ended up making my gradient a lot harsher and changing the colors a little bit more here. So for the edge, the second layer that I created in my overall materials for each one, I just made sure that I emphasized it a little bit more, just so you can see there is a color shift right there. So after that, my wooden back, I added a little bit more of the texture difference. So I just made it a little bit lighter, kind of made it look a little bit beaten up and rough because this is an older piece. So some discoloration is there. And I made that a lot darker than the rest of my project because I wanted to make sure that it does look like it is in the back. My prop bottom is over here, nothing too crazy. In the concept, there is a difference between the two of them. So this one is just a brown and yellow, and then this one is just like a golden brown. So that is pretty much what I just did to these two. And then after that, any more wood texturing? Nope, that is all the wood that I did. The rest was the prop, the metal, and the flag. So I'm going to explain. Actually forgot this part right here. So in the concept, you see that there is some old chipped wood. So I guess naturally the wood looks like this, or they just really wanted to look cool. So for this, all I did was pick a color that was fairly close to the actual concept. I didn't color pick it exactly because there was a bit of a hue color coming off of it and I didn't want to add that to it. So what I just did is I added kind of a pale yellow to it. And then after that, I just went into the paint, got a I actually ended up getting a chalk brush from this. So I ended up getting one of these charcoal ones and just putting it in there. Nothing too crazy. I did change the opacity of it so it wasn't straight up like that. I wanted to make it look like it was actually worn into the wood, not that it would look like it sits there naturally. So just wanted to make it feel natural. The next part I'm going to explain is my cloth. So for my cloth, I kept everything pretty much the same. I actually dialed down a lot on some of these. So I created my base, and then in my concept you can see that there is a red fabric that lays below it. So here what I just did is I added another layer. I painted that onto my UVs, and having them laid out like this was very simple for me to just straight on just color it in there. And then I made the roughness a little bit different just so you can see there is a distinct look to it. And then the clasp, I did the exact same thing, just added a little bit of a darker color to it. I think I just duplicated that over. The edges, I ended up actually pulling that back a lot because I didn't want it to start adding color in the areas that it didn't need to. Since this is curved, I was using a technique that is what I use usually for hard surface. The cavities, I made sure it was a little bit darker. And then after that, I just did an AO, but I just added it a lot darker than the base color, just so it would look like shadows that naturally lay on the fabric. And then I didn't add texture details, obviously, but in this case, I added silver bolts, just made it metallic. It's just a metallic layer. And then after that, I added somewhat of a roughness layer to it. And then the metal rod is something I just slapped on from the same materials that I used from this. So I just duplicated that over. My silver coins were pretty basic. It wasn't anything too crazy. I just made sure that there was some roughness variation on it, so when you look through it, it doesn't just straight up look like metal. Coins are dirty and they lose its shininess and they sometimes get tarnished, so I wanted to add that. But in the concept, I saw that they looked, I wouldn't say fairly new, so I still wanted to add that detail to it. So after doing that, my next step was my metals. So I'm going to work and explain to you how I did that. So it's honestly the exact same thing that I did for my wood, except it's just a metal material. So here I added my color, I added my roughness, and I added my metal. So my metal was all the way to 1, and my roughness was a little bit shinier than it usually is. But the reason why is because I was adding all these other materials to it, and these I made all metallic as well, so they would all work together. But in this case, I went around giving this dirty look to the project, just to add to it. So these were to brighten up the project, because in Sketchfab it was looking very dark, so I just added those color variation that I learned to add some light to it. The AO is just, again, the same, darkening up the area. Bake light, the same, just darkening it up to make it look a little bit more worn out. And then after that, I added my edge highlight. I made sure that that was almost like straight up white, and the reason why is because I wanted the edge highlight to actually highlight. So I did that, as well as upping up the roughness, because I usually kept the other channels a little bit lower on the roughness to add that variation to it. And then I added my texture details to it, and that just helped give it a dirty, worn look. And that's honestly what I did with my metal maps. It's the exact same thing I did here. The only difference is in the concept. In the concept you see here, there's just a lighter metal that seems to be on the rim of the sword. I didn't do anything crazy with that. The same thing that happened here, I applied to the handle, and the same thing that was done on here is done on the actual helmet. So I will click those on so you guys can see that. So here you see on my my sword, there is a bit of a green tint to it. That is just me adding a little bit more opacity to my green light that I had on my this one right here. So I just added a little bit more light to it, just so I could have kind of that green gray look that I was trying to achieve for. For this, I just added yellow light lines to it, because that is what is shown here. And then for this, I made sure, for the sword as well, I made sure that this part was a lot lighter than this and this, since in the concept you can see that this part lights up slightly more. This one has a stronger AO, so that's what I just applied to the edges. And then after that, I was prepared to do some paper. The paper that I used here was the same that I used on top of here. It wasn't anything too crazy. I think I just removed one of the channels. So that is the paper. I kind of kept everything the same, since I didn't really sculpt this, and it was pretty simplistic in shape. All I really did was add a base color that was a little bit brighter, and then I just added darker colors on top of the project to give a old, worn, medieval look to it. So you have my edges right there, and then my cavity. So that just went all throughout, so that worked out for me. And then my AO to add kind of a variation to the color, because that usually happens with old paper. And then I added my baked lighting to it, which just gave an overall more yellow brown look to it. My edge highlights for some of the areas that are a little bit more worn down, and then my texture, which honestly gave a great paper look to it that is worn and old, something that looks like someone would make. And then after that, I added the writing. In the concept you can't really see the writing, so I kind of just finessed it by writing numbers and symbols and hoping that nobody reads that part. So that is honestly what I did for the paper. I did the exact same thing for the books. So after doing that, the next thing I did was this armor piece. This one was a bit difficult to work with, since I never really worked with leather, and in this I would say, yeah, that's leather. I also wasn't very happy with how this came out, and I will probably be coming back and changing this and applying what I learned at the end of this project to this, because this was something that I honestly struggled with, and I was trying to find ways to fix. But here, I wanted to make sure that I got the darker color here and the lighter colors here, as well as the silver buttons, so I was able to get those colors how I wanted them. This was honestly the material that I used for the belt, which I will be showing you how I did. So after working on that piece really quickly, which was honestly just copying the belt, applying the layer right here, and then copying the belt again, and then applying a lighter layer here. The next thing I worked on was this piece right here, which was the metal. This one, I wanted to give it a much more worn look compared to the other, so I added a more aggressive AO to it to just add that dirtiness to it. And then that was pretty much it. I kept the metals pretty simple since they weren't the main focus of the project. The next thing that I worked on was the book. This one, this one was causing me problems because, again, I've never really worked with leather, and I'm guessing that is what the material is. If you look here, it looks leathered, obviously, and here's leather, and then this one's leather right now. So for this one, it was just a lot of trial and error. I created my base color, which was this, which was a brown. I actually color picked this from an actual leather piece. And then the edges was something that was a little bit more warmer tone, something that looks like it would be in a piece of leather that's new. The next was adding a cavity that kind of went over everything to create a dark brown. Next was AO, just to create somewhat of a change in colors, almost as though, you know, it is skin. Bake light that just went over everything. Edge highlight on the edges just to show a kind of worn look to it. And then the texture details, I think, actually helped a lot because this is how it was starting to look and I was getting frustrated. And then I remembered this area right here, and I said maybe just adding a texture detail will give it more of a leathered, or at least give it a texture so it's not just straight up flat. So what I did was the same thing with the belt, except the belt was a lot lighter, and I ended up using a layer to have a height and color channel, push this back, and that was about it. And then the pot was here. So this one was honestly super simple to do. It's just gold and black, nothing too fancy. The black is a lot more reflective. Made sure that I didn't do pitch black, nothing too crazy. The feather was the only part that I had to look up and actually take the time to look through and Google, but I show you how I set that up in Sketchfab since I really didn't necessarily need to do that in Substance Painter. So after adding the pot, I added my books, and here I added the details that you see in the book here. This is in 2K. It looks a lot better in 4K, so after I'm done, I will be sure to show you how I did that. But for the book, it was a blue color, and this was a purple, so I just color picked from here, add somewhat of a gradient, just so it's just not a flat color, so it's like a purple here and a lighter purple here, a darker purple or blue here and a lighter blue here. So that is what I did here as well. And then the book leather is just the straps that are wrapped around the projects. And then the metal weird is this part right here. I still don't know what this is. Still trying to guess. You know, if you know what it is, please put it under the comments. It will actually be kind of interesting to see what you think this is. But that was just something that I ended up just using this texture onto here. I just ended up changing a few of the colors, so it was a lot more washed out than this. So the next thing I did was add the picture that you see here. So what I actually did was I brought this into Photoshop, did the outline of this area right here, made sure I fixed any of the angles, I flipped it so it was straight, and then I went into Substance Painter. And actually, let me see if I can find the actual PNG right here. So it's it's right here, and you can see the very crude, rough drawing I did. But if you look at it here, I just built the colors up. Again, I can show this on the 4K, so I'll show that when I'm ready to show this in 4K and explain how I did that. So I added my chalk layer, and this is the numbers that you see on the side. Surprisingly, this actually took some time because I wanted to make sure that it looks like it was broken up and it wasn't just a straight, you know, mouse. I wanted to actually make it look like someone was writing on the actual objects. So here I just did a swipe, and then I added this chalk type filter onto it so it can make it look broken up. So essentially, this is how my final project look, but not really. So I'm gonna move this over to 4K, and I'm gonna show you the last step that I did to this project. So here are my 4K textures, and here you can see it's not as pixelated as it was in 2K. So for this specific layer, what I did was I built up the design. So if you see here, you can see that there is a light, almost opaque pink, a black outline, and then a pink shield, and then these pink lines right here that are the same color as this. So what I did is just built it up. I added a pink opaque background, added the black line, and then added the shield and the 2 bars. And then here, this one, this one's my artistic masterpiece, but here what I did was I brought this in, pasted it on through here, so we're right there. So I just rotated it, found a perfect spot for it that would hit this area right here, and then I just built up the colors in these areas. I wanted to give it a kind of crude look to it, since it is something that isn't like printed on. It is going to be probably written by someone, so I just added that there. And then after I was done with that, I changed the opacity to I think like 75 and 60 to make it look like it is written on it, and kind of a worn fading look to it. I also added these lines. I don't know what it says over here, but I didn't want to forget to do that, so I added that to the project. So after this, you see my project, and it looks pretty decent. So after adding the wood textures, after adding all the metal and prop textures and seeing how it looks, I am going to add a top layer that one of my teacher was very kind to let me and a other student have. This is what essentially just adds a gradient for the entire project. He taught us what each of the layers do and how it influences, or how it affects the. So now that I am done, the next step I was going to do and did was add the top layer that my teacher, his name is Chops, did. His art station is down below, and if you have any questions about these top layers and the details and the effects that it has on the layers, you are more than welcome to message him on ArtStation. He will definitely respond to you, since he did such a great job on this, as well as allowing me and another student use it. But in this case, I will show it to you. This is just going to add a gradient to the entire project and give it a stylized look. So it's going to take a while, so I'll show you how it looks when it's up. So this is what it does to the project. It creates a gradient all throughout it, and I think it does a really good job of emphasizing the leather looks, the metal. It adds a little bit more to the AO, as well as creating those darkened looks of the metal that I wanted. So he gave us an in-depth tutorial of what all these do and how it affects the asset, as well as understanding how each of these layers and what they do and the filters that are in them do. So definitely check him out. His work is phenomenal, and he's honestly a great person to get critiques from as well for stylized work, since that is what he specializes in. So I also changed the opacity. If I was to have it at 100, it would look like this. So having it how it's supposed to be works for me. You can see quite the difference in it. So now that I am done texturing, the next thing I am going to do is again get a critique on this. So I ended up getting a critique on this from a couple of my lab instructors, as well as some acquaintances and friends from school and people on the Discord channel. I ended up asking for critiques on the club and Hand Painters Guild, and I got some really great feedback. So after that, I am ready to export these textures out. So I'm just going to show you really quickly how I did it. So in here, I just went to bookcase, went to my drive, went to bookcase, and then here I went to textures, so you will see it here. So I selected the folder, and I knew I was going to use Sketchfab, so to make my life a lot easier, I just clicked Sketchfab as my config, made sure that it was all in 4K, and then textured it out. And that's honestly how I went through my entire step 4. If any of you guys have any more questions about how I went around picking out the colors and how I looked at the concept, you're more than welcome to message me about that. But if you're also interested in the more into the layers and how I ended up texturing them, you are again also more than welcome to hit me up on ArtStation or my email about this as well. Since this is just a block out, I just wanted to explain quickly how I went through each of my groups. So now we are ready to set up our presentation shots.